Hello everybody and welcome back to Vehicles of War Thunder. While I had planned to start covering Soviet vehicles starting with BT-5, I ended up having a good match and another halfway decent match, not the greatest, not the worst, in the aircraft that we are instead actually covering in this episode. All the footage in the background is recorded via replays because I was not recording the matches because, like I said, I didn't plan to cover this vehicle yet. Typically I tend to at least start with the reserve vehicles, or thereabouts at least, but that didn't end up being the case this time, so we're sort of skipping ahead when it comes to the Soviet air tech tree. That vehicle in question that we are covering here is the Poliparkov ITP, for those that don't know what ITP stands for, and pardon that I'm going to absolutely butcher this. It's something to the effect of Istrabitil Tiazoli Pushenki. I definitely butchered that, I guarantee you that, but close enough. And that roughly translates to heavy cannon fighter. Now let's jump into the history of this prototype Soviet fighter. In November 1940, Nikolai Poliparkov proposed a new heavy cannon armed fighter to the Air Force Research Institute for an aircraft that had three purposes: to conduct active air combat with enemy aircraft, primarily the destruction of enemy bombers, to destroy enemy ground targets, and to escort friendly bombers. The aircraft was to be designed around either the Mikulin AM-37 or Kilmov M107P engines. There were two armament configurations for the ITP. The first consisted of a 37mm Sh-37 cannon firing through the propeller hub, and two synchronized 20mm Shavak cannons mounted on either side of the nose. The 37mm cannon had 50 rounds, while the 20mm cannons had 200 rounds each. The second configuration removed the 37mm and added a third synchronized 20mm Shavak cannon. As for the suspended armament, the ITP could carry either 8 RS-82 rockets or 200 kilograms worth of bombs. Construction of the ITP M1 began in May 1941 and was completed in October of the same year. However, because of German attacks, the aircraft would be evacuated to Novosibirsk and would not make its first flight until February 23, 1942. Because the M107P engine, which developed 1,650 horsepower for takeoff, proved to be unreliable, it was not possible to complete the tests in Siberia, and in late 1942 the engine would be replaced with the M107A, which also developed 1,650 horsepower for takeoff. However, to accommodate this change, the 37mm cannon had to be removed and was replaced with a third 20mm cannon, mounted on the nose. Presumably on top in line with the other two cannons, but none of my sources actually specify exactly where this third cannon was mounted. Flight testing was never completed on this model after the engine was replaced, and the airframe was instead used for ground static testing. The estimated maximum speed at 6,300 meters was 655 kilometers an hour, with a time to 5,000 meters of 5.9 minutes. The ITP M2 was constructed in Novosibirsk in 1942. The original AM-37 engine, which developed 1,400 horsepower for takeoff, also proved unreliable, and in December it was replaced with the more powerful AM-39 engine, which developed 1,800 horsepower for takeoff. The M2 would make its maiden flight on November 23, 1943. The aircraft would successfully obtain its maximum flight speed of 540 kilometers an hour at ground level, and at 2,500 meters it would achieve 570 kilometers an hour using normal engine power. Using WEP, afterburner, whatever you want to call it, my sources, one refers to it as afterburner, would achieve 600 kilometers and 600 kilometers an hour and 650 kilometers an hour respectively. However, as a result of the manufacturer's flight testing not being completed until June 1944, and since several other aircraft with similar levels of performance were already available, the decision was made not to push the ITP into production. Now, before we get into how this aircraft performs in-game, I do need to go ahead and mention this. Despite my best efforts to find first-hand sources, design documents, technical manuals, things like that, and particularly ones that have been translated into English, I have needed to rely on secondhand sources, and the information they all provide disagree with the engine used by the ITP M1 in-game right now. In-game, the engine the M1 is equipped with is the AM37, which, according to all of my sources, is the original engine used on the M2 model, before it was replaced with the AM39. Now, maybe Gaijin has access to official documents that my sources don't or didn't have access to when they were written. Some of them are a little bit on the older side. And maybe those official documents that Gaijin potentially has access to, I don't know for certain, contradict my sources. But at least based off what I can gather from my sources that I can find, the ITP M1 in-game is effectively a kit bash of an M1 and an M2, a similar situation to the T-25 American medium tank, where it was a kit bash of two different prototypes. If Gaijin wants this vehicle to reflect how it actually was, according to my sources at least, and again, if Gaijin has access to official sources that contradict my sources, use your official sources, obviously. But at least based off what I can tell, as the vehicle is in-game is not actually how it was in real life, and thus there's a few options if Gaijin wants to more accurately reflect at least what I can find according to my sources. They can either turn the aircraft into the M2 model, as the engine indicates it's supposed to be. This would entail removing the 37mm and adding a third 20mm, and either keeping the AM37 engine or giving it the upgraded AM39, the one that it was finally equipped with when it went and did its first test flight, as opposed to the unreliable AM37 that it technically uses in-game right now. The other option is for Gaijin to keep it as the M1 and fix the things that don't quite match up. This would entail replacing the engine with the M107P or the M107A. If they replace it with the M107A, according to all my sources, again, they would still have to remove the 37mm and add an additional 20mm. Personally, I would prefer keeping it as the M1 and giving an option to either to change your offensive armament, like some vehicles actually already have in game, namely with some aircraft. And depending on if you go with the loadout with the 37mm or not would determine if you are using the M107P or the M107A as your engine. Reminder again, the P has the 37mm cannon, the A does not. Now let's get into how the vehicle actually performs in game. At least as it stands right now. The ITP, as it is currently implemented in War Thunder, is a wonderful plane. The 20mm cannons make short work of just about any aircraft you could possibly face, including bombers, and the 37mm, which admittedly I hardly ever use, puts in good work when you're playing ground RB, allowing you to very quickly destroy many of the tanks you'll face at your battle rating. Admittedly, your 20mm also tend to be able to go through a lot of the stuff at roughly your battle rating as well, especially when you're diving down on them top down. But the 37mm always helps when you happen to run into one of those slightly heavier targets. The only real downside for the ITP, in my experience of using the aircraft, is that its engine tends to overheat fairly quickly as a match goes on, especially if you're wepping at all. And in Air RB in particular, because you will often be flying for decent lengths of time, especially at this battle rating of 3.3, this can potentially be an issue, because engine performance is actually impacted by how long the engine spends at higher temperatures. This is most obviously seen where the, for lack of a better way to describe it, red line is for oil and water temperatures as a match goes on, and especially if you constantly push your engine into the red, this red line will go down more and more until you're not able to stay out of the red and maintain the throttle you need to keep flying. By this, I mean, you'll notice that when you are wepping, the colors for the temperatures for engine, oil, water, etc. will change from a white to a sort of pale yellow to a more of an orangey yellow to a red. The longer you spend at hotter temperatures, the lower down the threshold is to fall into those reds, those various zones of, you know, red, orange, yellow, etc. And you're gonna often, in this aircraft in particular, because of the way it behaves, probably spend a lot of time often hanging out in that pale yellow to orange yellow if you don't WEP. So yeah, this aircraft tends not to be particularly great at long drawn out engagements, which tends to work fine. You got a decent amount of ammo, but it's not like tons. It's a little bit better than some of the other Soviet aircraft in the game around this battle rating, but it's still not the greatest in terms of ammo count compared to the ridiculous ammo counts that a lot of American fighters have with their 50 cals. Or even German guns. And so, like I said, this vehicle doesn't seem to perform particularly well at long drawn-out engagements, so you tend to go in, get a number of kills, head back to base so you have time for your engine to probably actually be replaced, but however it technically works, cool off, whichever way it ends up actually working in-game. So yeah, and of course, if you spend a lot of time at those, within the higher thresholds, your engine's performance starts to suffer more and more, which means you may not be able to stay at 100% throttle. You may have to drop down to 80 or something percent to avoid killing your engine. I will add this though before I sign off. The ITP is, in my opinion, one of the only Battle Pass vehicles that is unique, relatively speaking, and is also probably one of maybe 2 Battle Pass vehicles that I would say is actually any good. Based off my experience of using the other vehicles in the Battle Passes so far, that other vehicle that I would say is potentially any good would be the Centurion Mark V-1. I find that the M6A2E1 is not particularly great in my opinion. Its weaknesses are pretty easily spotted and penned by a decent amount of stuff at its battle rating. Especially because obviously you can easily ammo rack it if you go for the hull cheeks, generally speaking. Pretty much anything I think at its battle rating can pen those hull cheeks with just about any type of ammunition except for just generic high explosive. And that's pretty much a guaranteed one shot if you manage to cook off their ammo. The little wheelie American tank destroyer from one of the battle passes, not that great in my opinion. I've not actually really done much in it, but my experience with it hasn't been particularly great either. I haven't really messed around with the A6M6C from the latest battle pass, but it's a Zero that's trades off all of its maneuverability, or at least a good chunk of its maneuverability, for extra armor. My limited experience from the test drive earlier on the battle pass isn't particularly useful, honestly. I'd actually probably prefer the maneuverability over the extra armor. The French P39, I think it was, or whatever it is, it's just a P39, so, you know, whatever. And the F2G, I've had decent matches in it, but it's still not one that I think is particularly great, honestly. So, and I haven't really dabbled much with the ships. I just don't think they're worth it. I haven't messed around with the new EBR either much, but I get the feeling it's not that great either. And so really, like I said, I think the only 2 Battle Pass vehicles that have actually been any decent, in my opinion at least, are the ITP here and the Centurion Mark V-1. And honestly, Centurions in my experience aren't that great either. So the fact that the Centurion Mark V-1 somehow manages to be decent compared to a lot of other Battle Pass vehicles kind of says something about a lot of those vehicles. They're just not that good, in my opinion. But that's going to be it, I think, for this video. I will see you all next time, where we will be I believe, dabbling in something that is a little bit Swedish and a little bit Hungarian, I believe. Depends on if I end up, having a surprise good match in something else that results in a change of plans, but I don't expect that to be the case. But yeah, so I'll see you all next time. A quick reminder that I do have a Patreon and a Discord. I do highly recommend that you join the Discord so you can stay up to date on what's going on with the channel, because that is my go-to place for posting about that type of stuff. As for the Patreon, if you find yourself enjoying this series, or any of the other series on the channel, really, but particularly this one, that is one of the easiest ways to support this channel, but it's not necessarily the best. There are other ways to support the channel that help it significantly more than Patreon, in terms of what I end up getting as a result of the payouts. And of course, if you support the channel via any of those methods that help the channel out, it allows me to be able to justify spending money on buying premium and marketplace vehicles that I do not have access to, either because I did not play that event, or, especially when it's a crafting event, because I just couldn't be fucking bothered. Crafting events here in War Thunder are terrible, and I never participate in those beyond just selling the crap that I get from them, because they're just not worth the grind. They're really not, in my opinion. But yeah, so if you want to be able to allow me to be able to actually justify spending money on some of those, as I mentioned back in the M6A2E1, I don't have the script in front of me, but some of these vehicles are stupidly expensive to buy, and I just can't justify a lot of those costs. Certainly not without some sort of support. So yeah, so that'll be it for this video. I will see you all next time, like I said, where at least the plan is to dabble in something that's a little bit Swedish and a little bit Hungarian. But I will see you all then. Goodbye and farewell.